Hello there everyone and welcome to the 148th edition of DF Direct Weekly, which is and shall always remain our weekly discussion show discussing the latest gaming and technology news. Bunch of stuff to get through this week, mostly centred on Sony's latest State of Play presentation. Joining me to go through all of this stuff, it's a big welcome back to Oliver Mackenzie.
Hey Rich, I'm joining you from a new undisclosed location, but as always it's a pleasure to be on the show.
No longer within the GameCube, though.
No, the GameCube has been retired.
Okay, fair enough. And John Linneman, hi.
Hello, it's good to be here, and it's good to have Oliver back there from his brand new Batcave equivalent, which
his new lair.
It remains undisclosed to all of us. He could be anywhere on the planet right now, for all we know.
Indeed. Okay, good stuff. Let's crack on by talking about the State of Play. Lots to get through here. Okay, so State of Play 2024, it was our first look really at Sony's plans for the coming year because, they've been unclear up until now, and there's been a certain degree of uncertainty about the amount of input that first-party studios are going to have. And I guess mostly it was a third-party showing. Where should we start? Let's start with the game that really caught our attention that probably isn't going to be coming in 2024. Death Stranding 2 for Kojima Productions. I'm going to kick this off with a wow, but I'm interested in your opinions on this one, John, because it's pretty stellar stuff.
Oh, I think my opinions are pretty well known at this point. It was an excellent trailer, and I gotta say, like, kudos to Kojima Productions for finding a way to produce a first-party published game on both PlayStation and Xbox. That is an impressive accomplishment, and hopefully people will enjoy both games as a result. But this one's interesting for beyond the. So first of all, there's the game itself, the concept, the visuals, the storytelling. I was a big fan of the original. I've gone over that many times as to why. It's a very curious, strange game, but it did a lot of interesting things for like open world design, trying to change it from focus on the hitting your waypoints and just reaching those points and actually putting an emphasis on the traversal part and planning. But that story was weird. It wrapped up, but it kind of came together in the end, I would say. But this trailer then comes along and you're just like, what is even happening? And that's what I admit, that is one of the things I've always enjoyed about Kojima produced games, is that he is kind of a showman with how he presents these things. I mean, that goes back, I think, to Metal Gear Solid 2. Yeah. Which, by the way, there's a shot early in that when they're inside that little facility with that very cool image of the two characters sort of presented in a monochromatic fashion, where some of those scenes reminded me of the tanker in MGS2, and it was cool to see it kind of done in really high definition. But so the main thing here is that this is our first real look at, I would argue, current gen only Decima, right?
Yeah.
Because Horizon Forbidden West was a cross-platform game. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the DLC was PS5 only, but it's still based on a cross-generation game. This game is clearly being made specifically for this new generation, and likely the PS5 professional as well, mm-hmm. which we presume to exist. We'll see. But the quality of everything on display, both in terms of the artistry and the actual technical makeup, was really truly outstanding. The character rendering still phenomenal as it was before, including one of my new favorite things, as many others, is the low frame rate puppet that simulates stop motion animation, which was simply delightful and very, very unexpected. And that kind of ties back into where I was going before with, like, that's the thing about Kojima games, is like, it's like this, they present something to you, this vision of something with a lot of different visuals and concepts and ideas that on the surface don't make any sense. And it actually creates a sense of mystery, and you want to learn more and see more of what's here. And I think they do a really surprisingly great job in this trailer, in a way that reminded me of watching trailers at E3 during the early 2000s, rather than the more commercialized, cinematic, CG-fied style stuff that is common these days, where it's this perfect blend of tantalizing story segments with a lot of gameplay shots showing various environments that you'll explore. And man, those environments, the sheer level of variety on display here compared to the original game is pretty staggering, I think. I mean, what do you think, Oliver? I mean, one thing that we should really talk about, actually, I'm just seeing it now, is the fluid simulation stuff. That's actually one of my favorite things about it, and what really elevates this. There's that part where he's running through sort of a dry riverbed, and you actually see the water sort of chasing him through it and knocking down bridges along the way, and just that sort of interaction. We saw stuff like this with the tar in the first one. I think that's really cool, and it's the kind of stuff you don't see often in games, where it's beyond just the visuals. It's more about how those visuals interact with the world.
Yeah, I think the fluid looks really cool, and I mean, I've been playing through Death Stranding just recently for an upcoming piece should be on the iPhone, and it is reminiscent. You are reminded a little bit of the stuff with the tar, but here it does look quite a bit better. And there's some like interesting stuff, like there's some pre-calculated destruction in the trailer that I thought looked really good as well. Just in terms of the technique, so I did scan through the trailer looking for evidence, telltale signs of a couple things. So the reflections do seem to be screen space reflections. At 340, Sam is running across, and there don't seem to be occlusion issues. But then at 439, in that kind of like that boardroom area, if you look at the standalone trailer, it almost looks like Sam has a bit of a screen space reflection skirt to him, where the occluded details like this dark space behind him. And then at 502, there are obvious SSR occlusion issues at the sides of the frame. That's one detail that indicate they're probably screen space reflections. And the shadows, they do look very pristine and very clean throughout, but I did see some shadow aliasing at 655 on the enemy's shoulder a little bit, and then at 140 there appears to be some shadow aliasing along Sam's back. So that would sort of indicate some kind of rasterized technique, although in some scenes I did note like a little bit, almost what looked like a little bit of contact hardening around the shadows. So maybe there's a mix of different things in there they're doing. And then I also noticed it at 309, when the pod bay doors open, I'm not sure if you noticed this, John, but there's light that's being reflected off of the pod bay door as it opens, and it really does fill that space with reflected light. And it does look like some kind of potentially real-time or ray-traced global illumination technique. That's what really screamed out to me. And then also the lighting throughout the trailer is very consistent looking. And at 438 as well, when the lights are coming on, it does remind me a lot of what I would expect from a title with ray-traced global illumination. So I am wondering if maybe that's part of the feature set of current generation Decima, as you put it, if that's part of the fundamental feature set that we're going to see in presumably the next Horizon game and this title, because the lighting presentation really did remind me of what I typically see and expect from a title with a ray-traced global illumination technique.
Absolutely. And I think that pod bay door that slowly opens and the light sort of spills into the room, we've not seen any lighting like that in a Decima title before. The indirectly lit or directly lit areas, when they combine like this, like there is some pretty impressive indirect lighting in Horizon Forbidden West that's pre-calculated, but it's not dynamic in this way. And this is exactly the kind of scene where you could show it off. It has a very soft fall off of like sort of the ambient shadowing around the edges of that door off to the left and right. And just the way the light naturally spills in. It's either a very, very accomplished and impressive rasterized solution, or maybe they are actually leveraging ray traced global illumination. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't be surprised if, Decima's engineering work is continued. It would make sense to invest in technologies like this. And given that we're seeing RT like GI, it kind of jives the fact that we're not seeing reflections or shadows or anything like that with ray tracing, because layering on too many of those effects would be likely prohibitively expensive, shall we say.
Okay, yeah, I think RTGI would be a absolutely brilliant upgrade to the existing Decima engine. It just makes sense with that kind of game, right? And the sort of trade-offs that you get with the existing sort of solutions we have, there's this kind of, how can you describe it? There's an accumulation effect on RTGI. It wouldn't be that impactful on this type of game, whereas you look at something like Marvel Spider-Man, it would be a lot more difficult to integrate without looking a bit poor. So yeah, I mean, that makes sense. And just, what could I say? It just seemed like a maximum upgrade in just about every regard. Character rendering, again, next level. Obviously, the amount of variety that we saw in the environments was pretty stellar. Lighting, just superb. I don't really know. I mean, you can heap on the superlatives on this, but this is the first proper sort of current gen thing that we've seen from Kojima, and it's just looking brilliant. What can I say? Not sure what's going on with those hands of Agile's face.
Oh yeah.
There's a lot of weird stuff in here. I mean, this is the thing that I kind of enjoy about. I mean, I'm not a Kojima fan at all. I really don't like his sort of narrative stylings, but there's a lot of weird stuff in here, and this is the thing that I kind of like about this presentation. First of all, it wasn't rushed. They basically just said to Kojima, by the look of it, here's 10 minutes, do whatever you like with it. Secondly, Kojima himself edits the trailers, right? And I believe,
as far as I know, yeah.
I think at the end of this one, it says edited by Hideo Kojima, which kind of suggests that refers to the trailer. So, yeah, I mean, this is basically a creator in complete control of the vision, teasing what he wants to be teased at this point. And you can certainly say that it's highly intriguing and visually astonishing. And I think I read somewhere that we're looking at a 2025 time release window. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
which
in the trailer.
Disappointing, but, basically these things take time, right?
I mean, I would say that's sooner than I expected, to be honest. That's a pretty good thing. What I'm more curious about is, like, presumably if the PS5 Professional is indeed real, what that will mean, because this trailer is presented at 30 frames per second.
Yeah.
And while that was true of Horizon Forbidden West as well, it did end up with a performance mode. I'll be curious to see if they're able to do 60 FPS on the original PS5, or if that's going to be something where, like, they can do a PS5 Pro mode at 60 as well, perhaps. I don't know. Though, in this so games like this, like really these stupidly good looking games, this also applies to something like Hellblade 2, where these are slow games. They are not designed to be like action-packed, ultra-responsive experiences. And I think as a result, especially with both of their cinematic aspirations, I think 30 frames per second is actually just fine. And it looks good, actually, I would argue. But it is nice. It would be nice to have the option for 60.
Right. So do you think conceivably 60 frames per second could be a professional bonus, as it were?
I mean, it seems like it could be. I mean, I would genuinely be surprised if they tried to hit 60 with these visuals on a regular PS5.
I mean, Kojima likes 60 frames per second games. I think the one thing that came out when we talked to them for Death Stranding on PC, we got this astonishing quote where we were told that Kojima was actually targeting 60 on the original Death Stranding, but just couldn't do it on the PlayStation 4. So,
interesting.
Yeah, that would kind of make sense for a PS5 Pro to actually have a 60 mode. But, who knows? I mean, what Decima achieved on the standard PlayStation 5 in Horizon's performance mode is quite special, I think. Yeah. Anything more to talk specifically about this? Because we did have that extra bonus chat at the end where his new game was revealed.
Yeah, well, I assume it's probably still in the conceptual stages.
Yeah.
But it basically, to me, knowing how long games take to make and knowing Kojima's age, to me, it feels like he just announced like his final project ever.
Really?
Right?
Well, he did say it was the culmination of 40 years' work, didn't he?
What I mean is, like, it's probably going to take a long time to create, and it's probably something that will extend beyond. Maybe he'll even work on like a sequel or two for it, but I feel like he's heading in the direction of whatever that IP is going to be sort of like everything that his career, like the culmination of his career, as he says, will finalize there. And then I suspect after that, we might see him retire. I don't know.
Interesting.
I mean, that seems plausible to me at this point. Well, and that's actually kind of that's the weird, modern game development, with the amount of time, the number of years it takes to make stuff, you start to think about games in terms of, well, this creator has only X number of games left in them until they retire. Right. And for us as well, like, game releases used to come fast and furious, and now they take 5 and 6 years a piece. Right. So like we're all running out of time. And like the medium it's not even, it's more about what will we be able to experience while we're still alive at this point. I've been thinking about that stuff lately. Like, we're just careening towards this point where games are taking so long, like, not the most important thing in life, but it's something you enjoy. And it's like, I'm actually thinking about the end here. Like, what is going to be the last games that we see developed and released.
I had no idea that this would bring on an existential crisis for you, John.
It does. The fact that he mentioned, the way he phrased that, like, as like the combination of everything, and you just consider a lot of these developers, and obviously these teams can live on without these guys, right? They're obviously, he plays a big role in it, but I think there's more to it than that. There's a whole team driving it, but a lot of the big names that we know in games, they're not getting younger.
Well, it does seem that he's going back to the beginning, right? And
yeah.
Revisiting
yeah.
the espionage.
Metal Gear.
Yeah, the espionage genre. Thoughts on this one, Oliver?
It sounds a lot like Metal Gear without the Metal Gear IP to me. And maybe that's a reflection of where he wants to go with the project. Basically, just do something that obviously he's extremely well known for, but in a context that he can build a new story out and maybe do something interesting with it. And it's also like you get the nice transmedia elements there, which is a classic Kojima thing. Like, maybe it's more of a film than a game. And
the transmedia stuff, right?
Yeah, that's the way I felt about Metal Gear Solid 2.
Rich.
but I would expect this time probably he'll throw in like some big actors. So yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. He's also 60 years old, so he's getting on a bit, and this might be, I think this might be like Death Stranding 2, then move on to this new project. Maybe it sounds kind of like, from the way they framed it, that maybe Death Stranding 2 is the final title in the series. I suspect
it will be.
What do you make of the kind of final pan that revealed this? Is it Scient? There was no actual pronunciation given. So, and then the Columbia Studios thing as well. I mean, there is the sense that maybe they were very, very enigmatic in the interview piece, where they were basically talking about the game in very, very weird terms, and it was a lot of sort of watch this space stylings to it. But yeah, I mean, we got this pan back to Columbia Studios. There did seem to be this kind of sense that, okay, Sony is basically going to be throwing all of its sort of various media IPs at Kojima to play with here, which I find quite interesting. It's probably what he's always wanted.
Yes, I think so.
Okay, so another title we saw in the State of Play January 2024 was Stellar Blade. Now, we've had a look at this game before, but we had another extended look at it this time, and I think from a technical perspective it was looking really, really impressive. Oliver, do you want to take point on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I thought that it looked really, really good. From a rendering perspective, it's UE4, and you can pretty much tell from the first frame that it is UE4. Just in the way that the bloom looks and the post-processing, and, it just has a very UE4 look to it. I think the character rendering looks really good. It's sort of a semi-stylized look to it. The animations, I think, look terrific. It actually reminds me a lot of Nier Automata, in terms of sort of a kind of open worldish environment, certainly the style of the characters, the kinds of actions and animations, also a little bit of Bayonetta, so it's a little bit of a Platinum game style title, I would say, in that respect. It clearly is running at 60 frames per second. That's all strong stuff, and it is a PS5 exclusive, but you do see some screen space artifacts and reflections, you see some specular aliasing. Not a whole lot of evidence of like current gen rendering techniques, but it is a really good looking UE4 title, I think, from what we've seen so far.
Yeah, I agree. I really love the look of this game. I think it's very clearly inspired by stuff like Nier Automata, but with more accomplished technology behind it, given that Nier is kind of a rough looking game, I would say. There's a lot of variety in these shots as well. And like the basic setting of, so I get the impression that it's kind of this, it's almost like the Kowloon walled city, but built as like a spire in this giant like canyon environment, and then the surrounding areas, which I found like really compelling as like a place to explore and visit. And I really like these types of ruined environments. And then on top of that, the actual combat and stuff looks very promising. We'll have to wait and see if they can actually pull it off, because that's not easy to get right. And I'm not sure if this studio is actually proven, but given that it is a Sony published game, I'd imagine they've provided additional resources and investment into helping these guys polish it up, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought it looked spectacular in many ways. And yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying about it being sort of, classic Unreal Engine 4 feature set. But I think this is a really great example of how when you have really talented artists, really pouring their abilities into this, you get something that's greater than the sum of its parts, I think. Character rendering looked great. The sheer density that we had on offer in some of those scenes just looked superb. What could I say? I was kind of blown away by it in many ways. And we saw a lot more of the game this time than we did last time around. It is targeting 60. I think there were some drops in there.
Oh, there's possibly a lot of drops, actually, I would say. But it seemed to be inconsistent.
It seemed to be improved over what we saw in the initial showing, at least, possibly, yeah. I'm really sort of excited by what we're seeing here. And can't wait to see more. Now, this one is coming out not too far along from now, right? Isn't it April, I believe?
Yeah, that's actually the only bummer, is that I'm happy that it's close, but it's going to hit when I'm visiting the U.S., so I'll be on vacation. I really wanted to cover this too, but it looks like Oliver, I'm going to need your help again.
Hand the baton over.
The baton is in your hands.
I do sort of like the way that a global launch for a major title is. It's a bit of a bummer because you're on holiday. They should just wait until you're back.
Wow, when you put it that way, I mean, that sort of makes this job sound pretty cool, doesn't it? It's like, yeah, I wish I could do this work. But I'm on vacation, gosh darn it. But hey, at least I can buy the US, the American PS5 physical copy of it with the ESRB logo rather than the freaking USK badge of shame.
Oh, of course,
which we have here in Germany.
Brexit has closed the avenue of actually having decent looking box art available.
I mean, what I've actually been doing, I've started buying most of my games just from Amazon Japan, because with the way the yen is and everything, it's actually often cheaper to just import it. And, I'd rather have that version over the German USK version. And if that fails, then I'll just get it from like France. I try everything to avoid buying USK versions of games because I don't like them on my shelf.
Just for people that don't know, the USK is like the rating system used by Germany, right? It's got this gigantic classification.
Dude,
thing.
It's so, oh my God, it's so big. Like, it's so big that it actually offsets logos and art design on like Switch cases often. Like, they have to push the logo over to the right because it doesn't fit. And you should have seen it at the tail end of the Vita days, because, the Vita cases are pretty small, right? And that USK badge, they do not allow it to decrease in size. So basically, like 1/3 of the cover is USK badge, and then they kind of fit the art around it. So it's bad stuff.
Any final thoughts on Stellar Blade before we move on?
Good. Looking more at the video, I love the hair sim on the character as she's like flipping around doing all these actions. Like, her hair looks really, really well done, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it's these long strands, and it's whipping and moving, all individual looking strands, and like sort of colliding with her body in a way that doesn't look janky. And I really appreciate that kind of stuff, and I think it looks cool in motion. Okay. And then last but not least, it has a really good logo. Just gonna say it. That logo at the end, like the way it sort of the sparkly blue powder effect, and then I think I appreciate a good logo, and that's a good logo.
A little 80s, but I get what you're saying.
Yeah, it's cool.
Okay, let's move on. Another game that caught our attention at State of Play 2024 had to be Dragon's Dogma 2 from Capcom. Obviously, we're looking at an evolution of the RE engine here. It's doing things. Well, this is the great thing about RE, right? Which is that as new games come along that sort of push boundaries in different genres, RE has to evolve to accommodate that. And we're seeing that again here with Dragon's Dogma 2, and it looks absolutely terrific. Oliver, your thoughts, please.
Yeah, I thought it looks fantastic. Like you said, it is basically, I mean, the first real proper current gen exercise of the RE engine, I'd have to imagine. In terms of the feature set, I think it does look quite a bit better than other RE engine titles, which have thus far been cross-gen titles to my recollection. So they've been a bit more restrained. And this looks really good. It is at 30 FPS, which I hope they do have a high frame rate mode in there because of the style of game this is. But outside of that, I mean, I think it looks terrific.
It's 30 or unlocked?
It's unlocked. and I can tell from this trailer. And so I played an hour of this game at TGS, and that was feedback I gave to them. Not that they would necessarily be able to. I don't know how much. Basically, I think this is a game that should have an optional frame rate cap.
Right.
Because the way it played then and the way it looks in this trailer, the frame rate's kind of all over the place, where it's anywhere from like the 20s up to 60. And that sucks. It does not feel good. And it lacks consistency. VRR might help some, especially on Xbox. Right? And is this coming to PC? This is coming to PC, right?
You'd expect so.
Yeah, so PC would probably be fine, but that's my only real complaint with everything that they've shown, is that the frame rate is just all over the place. And at the same time, one could argue that that's part of the Dragon's Dogma experience. So
it's not a desirable part, though, is it?
No, but maybe it's a throwback. Like, remember this, guys? Remember the frame rate?
Come on. Sorry, Oliver, you were in the middle of your observations there.
Yeah, I mean, scrolling through this trailer, it is more variable. It just looked like 30 to me because it is like hovering around roughly that point. But yeah, if this is unlocked, then that's not a great sign. And Capcom has a bit of a history with unlocked frame rates in games. I think even with VRR, this wouldn't be that great. It is quite a variable experience down and getting to certain lows that you don't really want to see in a title. So yeah, I hope they do fix that, or at least cap it, because on consoles,
optional.
Yeah, on consoles, I don't think that would make for too great of an experience.
So anything from an engine perspective, I mean, obviously the sort of wide open scope of it is pretty impressive. I mean, you know, what could I say? Character design, monster design, effects work. RE is just brilliant. It just seems to be getting better and better.
Yes, so I agree, Rich. It is improving with each game. But the thing that really separates Dragon's Dogma 2, I think, from other RE engine games and games in general is the sort of the physicality of the battles. The creatures that you fight are often large, and we've seen plenty of large creatures in games before, right? It's not an uncommon thing, but I feel like in general, it's like they're just an object that's animated and they're placed inside of this map, and they have minimal impact on the environment around it, and the player's interaction with it usually amounts to doing swing animations and some basic sort of collision occasionally, and and that works well from a gameplay perspective. But this is a game that sort of, the enemies very directly interact with the world. They break down trees, crumble buildings. You can climb on the enemies, mantle them. When you see there's like a griffin or some kind of creature that flies over the village at one point in the trailer here that takes down buildings with it, and it really feels physicalized in a way that reminds me actually of something like I guess The Last Guardian or Shadow of the Colossus kind of stuff, but with even more granularity, of course. Or that scene where there's like a large tusk creature swinging sort of a club in the middle of the forest, and you sort of see all the trees sort of bend and sway as he does it. I think it's the physicality of these interactions that really separate it from other action games.
Yeah, I get what you're saying.
And that's I think that's really difficult to pull off. Having multiple super detailed, well animated models interacting with one another in that way, that's hard to implement and not something we often see. So it looks fantastic.
Another game which kind of came out of the blue in this particular state of play was the debut of Sonic X Shadow Generations. Now I'm going to have to obviously defer to our resident Sonic expert here, John.
Is that a title I should? I'll accept the title.
Resident Sonic expert. That would be that could go on your lower third.
Exactly. Could.
You seemed quite excited by this. I thought Shadow was persona non grata in the Sonic community.
There's a subset of the community that.
And is there
Shadow.
like some sort of Scrappy-Doo rendition of Sonic in there as well? Sonic Junior. What's going on?
Oh, are you okay? You're not familiar with Sonic Generations?
I'm not.
So the original conceit, the original Sonic Generations, the idea was an attempt by Sonic Team to create a fusion of modern 3D Sonic, which at the time was the Boost Sonic style of gameplay, with side-scrolling Sonic.
Right.
So the small Sonic is designed to look more like the original artwork from the Mega Drive games, but realized in 3D. And his stages are all played exclusively as side-scrolling stages.
Oh, okay.
Where the larger Sonic, they play like full 3D boost Sonic games. And
But they interact.
I have issues. Yeah, they do.
So like
they do actually.
like
It's like some
Spider-Man
sort of
No Way
weird
Home.
like, yeah, it's like some kind of weird time warp thing that happens, and they all end up in this strange like white world between levels. It's the story is whatever, but the game itself is actually a lot of fun. It's still a lot of fun today. And it was sort of this revisiting greatest hits of zones from Sonic's past, but all rebuilt and made. I mean, they're completely new levels. They're just based on themes that existed. But it was made for PS3 and Xbox 360.
Yeah.
It did get backwards compatibility on Xbox Series X, so Xbox in general, and it's awesome on there because it did update it to run at 60 frames per second at 4K. But it's still fundamentally a 360 game, and all the UI stuff looks terrible because it's designed for 720p, and it comes with the typical caveats of doing that backwards compatible stuff. So having a native version of Sonic Generations alone is nice, but it seems they've gone the extra mile and have created a ton of new content with Shadow. So it seems like the game itself has been expanded.
Right.
I don't know how much content there will be, whether this is like the equivalent of a small DLC or whether they've made like a mini sequel to the game, but with Shadow, because the stuff they showed with Shadow is not stuff that's normally in Generations.
Okay, intriguing.
So it's more of that game.
Okay.
And what's interesting is that, I mean, that was made on the Hedgehog engine circa 2011, and that engine has evolved. Obviously, they did Forces, and then the recent one, I guess, from 2022, Frontiers. And those all used more advanced versions of the Hedgehog engine. I'm curious if they've updated it for that. It's been confirmed that this is new footage because they show like a section in the Green Hill Zone at the beginning where the grass is lit incorrectly, one might argue, compared to the original. It's like a new minor rendering bug, and the appearance of that bug that doesn't exist in any version of Sonic Generations suggests that this is indeed actual new footage.
Okay.
Which it's kind of a fun way to figure that out, but hey, there it is.
It's a bit random.
So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And one thing, I would love it if they could get it up to 120 frames per second. I think they could in terms of demands, but Hedgehog engine games always seem to be capped at 30. Sorry, at 60, not 30, 60. They're capped at 60. Like if you do Sonic Frontiers on the PC, for instance, and all the other ones, they're all limited to 60 max, and mods to unlock it cause physics issues and other stuff like that. So,
Any thoughts on this one, Oliver?
No, not too many. I'm not very familiar with the original title, but this does look interesting.
It's okay.
It does look interesting. Well, thank you, John, for forgiving me. No, I think this looks cool. I mean, Shadow's in there. I have no idea what that means in this context, but I think it's cool that someone, at least one person, is a big fan of this announcement.
What is the Shadow thing? Why is there controversy over Shadow, John? Just for those who aren't.
Wait, there's controversy?
Well, people don't like him for some reason. I'm curious as to.
So he was introduced in Sonic Adventure 2 on the Dreamcast as sort of a counter to Sonic. He was part of the villain side, but he's not actually a villain, and he's been in many, many games since then. And he's largely considered part of the 3D Sonic era canon, so I think fans that are more into the older games are less predisposed to enjoy his presence. I don't mind him; he's fine.
Okay.
I have nothing to really say on that. The Sonic fandom, though, don't Google it. Don't go and just trust me on this. Just enjoy the games and pretend that all the other stuff around it is not happening. The only thing you should pay attention to is the Sonic Amateur Games Expo and the stuff born out of that. That's good. Everything else, though.
Okay, fair enough. I'll bear that in mind. Okay, let's move on to the next game. This one's interesting. Ken Levine is back. There was a period of time where he just seemed to disappear from view, started a new studio, and initially the idea was to concentrate on smaller games that weren't BioShock. We're getting our first look at what he has come up with many years on. It's called Judas, and it would be perhaps unkind to say that it's very reminiscent of BioShock, though. What do you think about that, John?
Yeah, it does looks like BioShock.
Right.
I was initially hoping that it was going to be a sequel to Cyber Judas, which I don't know if you guys have played Cyber Judas. If not, I recommend checking it out.
Okay.
But this does, like, the very first thing you see after the company logo is from the creator of BioShock.
Yes.
So yeah, it looks like the aesthetic kind of built from BioShock Infinite, with those sort of brighter colors rather than the deeper hues of Rapture. But it's hard to say that much more beyond that, just that the gameplay itself is extremely reminiscent of that sort of game.
Yeah.
And I guess the question is, though, so I've seen some people kind of dunking on that, and I actually have a lot of interest in this, because I did think that those BioShock games did a lot of interesting things, and I did enjoy them. I think BioShock Infinite was a letdown, because even though conceptually it was neat, that it really strayed too far from the immersive sim roots and was kind of more of a simplistic shooter with only some very slight resemblance to the games from which BioShock was born. And BioShock itself was sort of a simplified take on System Shock 2, which he had also worked on.
Yeah.
Right? So I'm hoping that this at least gets back to perhaps the more hardcore variety of immersive sim, if you want to call it that. It sounds a little weird to say that, but basically something more in line with Prey 2017, if I may say so, which was a really well done one of those games, I would say. But from this trailer, it's hard to tell much. I think the game looks visually fine.
I think it looks terrific. I mean, the stylization in it is...
Yeah, the stylization. I guess it's hard to gather that much from it, because there's not that much gameplay in there. But I do think, obviously, the rendering and such is a gigantic step up from BioShock Infinite.
Yeah, absolutely.
A lot of modern stuff in there. It's not doing anything necessarily new, but it is... it looks cool. And the effects and everything is really well animated. There's that one thing where they stick the needles into your character's hands, and they sort of... That's a very gross effect. I don't know if you saw that, but that makes me uncomfortable. So I don't know. What do you guys think? Does this look like something you'd play? Interested in the visual design?
I mean, I agree that it looks like an incredible amount like BioShock. Even down to the rendering, like you have that same stylization of the character models. It's very distinctive with the really exaggerated proportions on a per character basis. There are some really cool effects, though. I like the kind of digitizing effect at about 1 minute 25 seconds, which kind of shows you the polygonal mesh of the enemies. I think that's cool. And then also the needle thing that John pointed out, where it's almost like printing flesh on the character's hand. That's interesting.
It's horrific.
I'm not seeing this is the current gen on the game. I'm not seeing personally any really serious evidence that we're seeing any particularly current gen features here, but it does look very good. It looks very clean. It's very UE4, but kind of a recurring theme. But I think it looks good for what it is. You know, not every game needs to push the state of the art, and this looks perfectly great for what it is.
Trailer was 32, by the way, I noticed.
Yeah.
Which was interesting.
Okay.
That may not mean anything, but it's also worth pointing out that it is 30 frames per second thus far.
Okay, let's move on. Metro Awakening next. This was a really interesting addition to the lineup in the State of Play 2024, because obviously, while there has been some activity with PlayStation VR 2, there is the sense that the momentum has been kind of dropping off, and we kind of need something like this. John, I'm going to come to you again. This is, a VR game. You're deeply invested in VR now. This is a multi-platform VR experience, as far as I'm aware. PC, PSVR 2, and Quest. It's been put together by the creators of Arizona Sunshine, not 4A games, even though 4A do have their own experiences with VR. Obviously, a very short trailer, but it's looking promising, right?
Yeah. So, as you said, this is by Vertigo Games, which has experience with the Arizona Sunshine games, which are pretty good, I would say.
Yeah.
But those were also targeting somewhat lower spec machines. Whereas this, looking at what we're seeing in this trailer, this does seem to be dramatically more visually impressive than anything they've done in the past. It's sort of in line with what you'd expect from Metro. It seems to be in development for PSVR 2 and PC. There's a Steam page. I suspect that there won't, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I'd imagine that there's not going to be a native Quest version.
Okay.
And if there is, then I'd be super impressed and also wonder, would that mean Quest 3 only? because there's just enough going on here where I think that might be too tall of an order. We'll see.
Yeah,
But either way, I actually think... Yeah, go ahead, Oliver.
It is actually confirmed for Quest 2, 3, and Quest Pro.
What?
Yeah.
They're doing this for Quest?
Yeah.
Oh, man, that's... All right, then.
That's impressive.
We'll see if... I mean, to be fair, I guess Arizona Sunshine 2 had a fair amount of stuff cut down to run on Quest, but it's also a very bright game where this is more like light and shadow. So I'll be curious to see how they modify it to work on those hardware platforms. But I guess it makes sense in terms of the audience, right? There's a lot of people on the Quest.
Yeah.
But this looks like something I might actually play on the Quest 3 wirelessly to the PC, though. Funny enough, since we're talking about PSVR 2. But I actually think Metro as a game, the concept, what they're showing here is perfect for VR. These sort of tight spaces work super well. I think better than large open spaces, actually, because when you have stuff in close proximity to you, your eyes are more convinced by the scale.
Yeah.
Moving through this darkness, the weapons handling and everything looks really nice, and it seems to be following the Half-Life Alyx model, which I'm always a fan of. It might make sense to have some of the weapons be a little janky Metro style, where you kind of got to fiddle with it to unjam it. So I'll be curious to see if they play with that stuff. But I guess the big question I have, though, is the engine it's running on now, because I believe their prior games were Unity based.
Wow.
Maybe? I think so. I kind of need to double check that, actually. But yeah. Okay, so based on what I'm seeing here, it does seem like the Arizona Sunshine games were both Unity based.
Yeah.
This stuff here in this trailer, to me, looks beyond what we typically see from Unity. If they're able to do this in VR with Unity, then I would say this is shaping up to be one of the most impressive things we've ever seen.
I can spoil this one as well, John, if you want me to.
Is it Unity?
I'm looking at this PlayStation Store page, and it says powered by Unreal Engine.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So they drop. Yeah. Okay. I was gonna say, if this was actually Unity, I was gonna be like, man, these guys, they just set a new bar. Okay, so they switched to Unreal, just like everybody else in the world.
Guess so.
Anything to add to that, Oliver?
No, I think this looks really good. It looks a lot like the content, frankly, that I sort of expected to have at the PSVR 2 launch, outside of the Horizon game. Like, kind of interesting, kind of AA or AAA-ish experience-driven titles that are a little bit more cinematic and have some interesting aspects to them. This, like you said, it looks a little bit like Half-Life Alyx in terms of the way they're handling the VR-ness of it. I don't know what the right term is to use there. But it does look good. I'm interested in it. I personally have not used my PSVR 2 in quite a while, so I'd love to bust it out for this title. But yeah, it looks certainly more appealing than the other PSVR 2 game that we saw, I would say. And I hope to see more of this.
that thing.
More of these kinds of games.
What was that called?
I don't even know. It was
Legendary Tales.
Legendary Tales, yeah.
That's what it was. So funny about that, when I first saw that being shown, I was like, wow, this looks like kind of like it was inspired with his original PlayStation tech demos of Kingsfield 1.
Right.
You know, that's the feeling I got, where it's like lots of skeletons and punching these dudes through tables and such. But I have no idea. I appreciate, though, how it has the subtitle action role-playing game at the card there.
Just to
Legendary Tales action role-playing game.
Just to get that out in the open. Still waiting for that Kingsfield DF Retro, John. Know you're a busy man. Hashtag just saying.
Oh man, I should do that, yeah. One of these days. Okay,
let's move on. Rise of the Ronin. This caught our eye. Team Ninja are back. A very different game to what they've done in the past, seemingly. Oliver, your thoughts on this one? It's been quite contentious, I think, amongst the audience.
I think people are a little bit hung up on the visuals. And I think that from my perspective, if you know Team Ninja, it won't be that surprising or that upsetting at all, because it does look a lot like their Katana Engine games. It looks a lot like Wo Long. It looks a little bit like what we saw from the infamous Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin.
Okay.
And I think this is their first current gen-only title. I'm not seeing a whole lot of evidence of visual improvement relative to those earlier games, especially in pain points like GI and character rendering, especially in the phases. But it is an open world title, which is new for them. Unfortunately, this isn't also it doesn't seem to be running at a consistent frame rate.
Yeah.
And I do worry that could be in the final release as well.
That's how you can tell it's current gen only.
Exactly, yeah. Because some of the other titles do suffer from technical issues even on current generation hardware. So I'm worried about that. But the combat does look good. There's some cool stuff as well. Like I'm not gonna, there's some cool stuff, I would say. Like there's some snow deformation, and there's the grass reacts to an explosion at about 1 minute 59 seconds in, but the animation isn't totally convincing there. The grass kind of just goes haywire from the explosion. So yeah, I think if you know Team Ninja's work, this will not come as a big surprise. But if you aren't super familiar with their work, then it might be a bit disappointing. But I think the game itself will probably be quite good based on their pedigree.
Okay. Anything to add to that, John? I don't know what to make of this, to be honest.
Yeah, I think, Oliver, you're spot on. This is probably going to be an excellent game. Their recent titles, they're extremely well made in terms of core gameplay mechanics. And based on what we're seeing in the combat here, that looks to be continuing. So I have zero doubts about that. But like you said, yeah, it has a lot of the same trademark issues that you'd expect from a Team Ninja game at this point, visually speaking. I would argue that it's less visually striking than Ghost of Tsushima in many ways. Which, yeah. But hey, we'll see. I mean, it's cool that they're making this, I guess, and I'll be curious to see how it's received. But yeah, beyond that, not too much to say.
Let's move on. Until Dawn. Now, this has been a rumor that's been circulating for some time now that the game would get a revamp for PlayStation 5 and PC, and lo and behold, it has come to pass. What's curious about this is that the original was created using Guerrilla Games' Decima engine, had extremely variable performance on PlayStation 4, which was essentially cleaned up on back compat under PlayStation 5, which is fantastic. But now we're getting an actual PlayStation 5 version, and we seem to be migrating from one engine to another, which is interesting, right, Oliver?
Yeah, I mean, apparently they're using UE5 for this one, and it seems odd to me because you'd assume that a Decima title would be able to be ported to PS5 and PC systems without an enormous deal of difficulty. It also doesn't need a whole lot to work really well visually. It looked really superb on PS4 systems. I think high-res rendering, 60 FPS, it could look really good even without substantial upgrades. Visually, the trailer did look excellent. It's just short snippets, and I'm not sure how it compares to Until Dawn's original incarnation. I need a side-by-side for that.
Yeah.
But it does look very, very good for sure in this showing. So it'll be curious to see how the final version pans out.
Mm-hmm. John, what do you think about this? I mean, does it look substantially different to the original?
Actually, I would say I'm fairly confident that what this is sort of a setup for a sequel. I'm going to say it. I suspect that Sony want to revive Until Dawn and to make sure that people understand where the series comes from. They've decided to sort of recreate, remaster, whatever you want to call it. I guess it's kind of a remake in many ways since they've switched engines and it's all new rendering features. And that seems to be what they're doing. So I suspect that'll come out. This will come out this year, and then in the next year or two, we'll probably have an Until Dawn 2 by a different team. Maybe the same guys that have been doing the Dark Pictures stuff. They did the Quarry as well, which was actually rather good, I would say. Mm-hmm. So all that stuff will be interesting to see. As far as the visuals, though, I mean, it does look noticeably better. You can see there's more advanced rendering going on, but I kind of agree that the original still looks good enough, right? Like, it's just... these improvements are certainly welcome, but it's just strange to me that this does not feel like a game that really needs this kind of upgrade.
Okay.
Just given the quality of what was already achieved on PS4.
Okay, if they are effectively relaunching the franchise, this does kind of make sense, though, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's why I'm like, okay, it makes sense. There is no confirmation on this, by the way. It's just my best guess is that this would be the reason to do this. It's because they want to relaunch the franchise.
Yeah.
I guess there was technically an Until Dawn sequel, kind of, with the Rush of Blood VR shooting game, but that was so far removed. I guess my biggest question, though, is if they do an Until Dawn 2, are they going back to that team that I just mentioned with the Dark Pictures? because they've continued to make Until Dawn like games, but with less production value, I would say. So maybe Sony's finally decided, you know what, let's go back to these guys and ask them to revive the franchise with a sequel. So we'll see.
There's no specific release date that I'm aware of, just 2024.
Yeah.
This is also like tying into a little bit of transmedia stuff because they're doing an Until Dawn movie, apparently, I read a couple days ago.
Right, okay.
So that could be part of it as well.
Dang, I didn't realize it was such a big franchise.
Yeah, I didn't really,
apparently so.
Yeah.
Okay, obviously we'll be chasing up on that in due course, but let's move on. Final sort of thing we want to talk about with this particular state of play was the return of Silent Hill. We actually got 2 entries here. Silent Hill, the short message, which is out now. It's a very small, or relatively small rather, free-to-play game created by Hexadrive, which we'll talk about in a minute, John. And secondly, we saw Silent Hill 2, the new remake, which I think that was a very sort of controversial showing, certainly vis-a-vis the stuff that we've seen already. Let's talk about the short message first of all, John. We've not had the chance to play it yet. I mean, I literally booted it up this morning just to take a very, very quick look at it, and I noticed the Hexadrive logo pop up, which I wasn't expecting. It wasn't in the trailer, but this is potentially really awesome stuff because Hexadrive is like possibly one of the most interesting developers out there with some interesting history behind them.
Yeah, they seem to be kind of rising stars for a while. And in fact, I have a connection with them because they were the ones contracted out to essentially fix the broken remaster of Zone of the Enders 2 on PS3, where Konami took it away from High Voltage Software and had Hexadrive rebuild it completely from scratch, and they did a significantly better job. And that was the second thing ever that I covered on Digital Foundry. And then they also went on to do things like the Okami HD remaster on PS3.
Right, okay.
With its very high-res rendering. It was 1080p, but it used 4x MSAA.
Yeah.
It was not 4K like some things had suggested, but and I think they did the EX Troopers games, if I recall, at least the PS3 one. I don't know, are you guys familiar with EX Troopers?
No.
Very underrated. It was an anime style spin-off of the Lost Planet games.
Oh, interesting.
And it was very beautiful looking and really, really cool. And it was probably my favorite Lost Planet game in the end. But it's rather unusual, and I think Hexadrive made that. But I haven't heard a lot from them recently. I'm sure they've been up to stuff. But
yeah,
I too was surprised to see them pop up here. And I guess based on what they did with Zone of the Enders, they at least already had some sort of relationship forged with Konami.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, did they develop this thing entirely themselves, or were they simply the tech team behind it?
It's unclear at the moment. To be clear, we are doing a standalone video about this.
Tom's working on it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, it does look absolutely terrific. Unstable frame rate is unlocked, but, the quality of the visuals is outstanding. I'd like to play more. I've literally just played the first few minutes of it. But it's great that this is... I'm kind of wondering what the commercial angle is. How is it being paid for? It is...
it's Silent Hill PT.
but that was a teaser for a project in the works, right? And this is like, what is this? Mm-hmm. I'm also confused by what they're trying to do here. So we'll see.
Mm-hmm. Any input on that one there, Oliver?
No, it looks terrific. I've not played it myself, but I mean, I imagine it's probably could it set up anything in Silent Hill 2? I guess it really can't.
No, I don't think so.
No, so it is a little bit strange.
Maybe it's some sort of precursor to some new announcement. Who knows? But it is an original work, so that's something to be excited about. But let's talk about the Silent Hill 2 footage, where somewhat bizarrely, Konami decided to focus on a combat-driven trailer, which seems a bit random and a touch inappropriate, possibly. John?
Yeah, so this is a tricky one, and it really gets me thinking about the nature of remakes and such. And so first of all, before talking about it, I do want to make it clear that I've never had an issue with remakes that take creative liberties because the original still exists, right?
Mm-hmm.
I remember when Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes was released, people considered it a travesty.
Right.
And
Yes.
you know, but it didn't take away the original game, right? And I think it was cool to see another vision, however weird it may have been, created. And I appreciate that to some degree. And that's how I'm going to enter the Silent Hill 2 remake, because fundamentally, I don't think they're going to be able to capture the original experience of Silent Hill 2. Because it was a very specific time in games with a very specific set of creators. What they did with that game is something that I'm not sure many other games have ever managed to match. You really get close. It was also something that for many of us, it was that specific time in our lives when we played it, and the impact of what it meant, what the things it explored. It was very special in that regard. But it was also, as much as I enjoyed that experience, it was an experience-driven game, and the core gameplay mechanics arguably weren't actually very good. Like
Right.
the moment to moment, what you did in that game was not good. The basic combat was very basic, hence the name, and but it was not, the game was not combat focused. Those were minor obstacles, and it was more the fear of the unknown, the darkness that sort of gripped the player. This trailer, in comparison, is extremely action focused in a way that kind of surprised me, where it's like extremely visceral looking. Like, yeah, we got all these physics in here. We got nurses vaulting over the walls. We've got pieces breaking off. I actually thought the combat and stuff looked fun and cool. It just seems slightly out of place in Silent Hill 2. And I'll be curious to see how that actually fits into the greater experience. But what I will say, though, is that visually speaking, I actually think they did a really good job capturing the color palette and visual design of the game, of the original game. More than I expected, actually. It really has that Silent Hill 2 look. The green of James's jacket, that's sort of like forest green's doll color that he wears, and his hair, it actually reminds me of the CG sequences from Silent Hill 2 in many ways.
Interesting.
So I like what they're doing there. Oh God, I just saw a QTE scene in there. That stuff. Yeah. I'm going in with an open mind, but we'll see.
Isn't the sort of case, I mean, there was the case that the original had a really firmly established aesthetic, which was kind of, how would you describe it? Sort of indistinct, grimy, dirty. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And this is kind of pristine rendering almost.
So
it looks very different. The atmosphere just feels different.
So one of the challenges that I always felt with Silent Hill, and this is very tough to overcome, is that Silent Hill was a product of the SD-TV era. And I think the artists very specifically leaned into it in a way. They took advantage of that technology to create something that plays with the imagination. I remember the very first time I ever saw Pyramid Head, who thankfully did not appear in this yet. Didn't see him. We'll see what happens with it. The first time you see him, he's behind these bars down a hallway. Your flashlight just captures a little glint off of his pyramid head. But because of the low resolution of the standard definition television, the pitch blackness of the scene, you visually can't make out what it is. You just see a distorted figure and then it goes away. And it's those types of moments, those little teases, and the way that your brain can't necessarily understand what you're looking at that really makes it special. And I think that's actually really difficult to almost impossible to achieve when you're dealing with really high resolutions and modern giant 4K TVs. I don't know how you solve that problem in an effective way. And there is no horror game in my experience personally that has ever managed to recapture the feeling of playing Silent Hill 2 or these old Silent Hill games on like a CRT.
Right.
It's so, yeah, I'll be curious to see how it goes.
Mm-hmm. Anything to add to that, Oliver?
Yeah, I thought the focus on combat was a little bit odd. I did think it looked a little bit limp, like the guns don't necessarily kick back too rapidly. The muzzle flashes, didn't look too satisfying.
Well, Oliver, you know, it's Silent Hill. We're just...
Yeah, I know. I know. But it does seem like there's an increased focus on combat here, or at least that's what they're trying to communicate to us. And that did look a little bit weird to me. I think it still looks great. I think the rendering looks awesome. Maybe not to quite the same caliber as the earlier showing, but this is gameplay footage for the most part and not cutscene footage. That's to be expected. But yeah, I think that it's understandable that people didn't really jibe with this presentation as much, but maybe that's just an artifact of the way this was presented, and maybe in the context of the full game it will be a better presentation.
John, what do you think of the animation? Because it kind of, there were certain reminders here of the Metal Gear Solid 3 remaster / remake that they're doing, where it sort of feels like the animation is of a certain age and it's surrounded by these higher quality visuals.
I can kind of see that, but I mean, I don't think they're taking original animations or anything. It's clearly all brand new stuff, and it's much more complex animation than what was in the original, arguably. Well, it's technically very different, though. Again, we get into the whole interpretation thing as to what they're trying to do. But yeah, it has a strange look to it, where it does look rather modern in terms of rendering features, but something about it does feel a little stiff, which, again, that's Silent Hill. So it's a difficult game to discuss for exactly that reason. I think.
So it's a hands-on scenario then.
I need to play this to understand, and I want to play it and look at this game. I would like to cover this game for sure, because I think there's going to be a lot of room both for looking at the game itself, but also putting it into perspective versus the original experience. So.
Absolutely. Okay. I mean, there were other titles within the state of play, but we've kind of run out of time to discuss them. Helldivers 2, for example, hopefully we'll be taking a look at that one very, very shortly, because it's due, early next month. But let's move on away from state of play. So this week was the release of a very, very big game, Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. It's been in development for many, many years now. It's been surrounded by a vast amount of controversy, because it is apparently set in the Arkhamverse, but it doesn't really look like an Arkham game, doesn't feel like an Arkham game. And it's moving away from the single player narrative, more towards the sort of games as a service thing, which typically here at DF we're not massive fans of, to say the least. But John, you decided to seize the nettle, to play the game, to actually find out what it's all about. And I'm very curious. I mean, obviously, you've got content on the way, but I'm curious to see what you think about it.
Yeah, so this was an interesting one, because you're exactly right. The build up to release has been somewhat of a disaster, I would say. The initial showing wasn't good.
Yeah.
A lot of the things that they chose to focus on in that early media, I think, sort of painted a very negative picture. But after playing it, I actually think it's all right. Okay. I think it's not... I wouldn't say I like it to the degree of the Arkham games by any stretch, but it is significantly more enjoyable to play through than I expected, and it looks better than I expected. And also, you can kind of, at least thus far, mostly ignore the games as a service stuff. So, which I have done.
Okay.
I saw some people complaining that, oh man, like this loot doesn't do much, so I don't, I'm not using it. And I thought that was actually positive, because then I don't have to constantly go into the menu and change stuff around. I can just kind of like, yep, okay, there's some loot, I'm just going to ignore that. I don't care about loot. But so first of all, let's talk about the visuals then. So this game fell sort of prey to one of the biggest problems in recent times, which is YouTube compression. The environment they've built is extremely complex. It's very dense, and it relies on a lot of texture detail and nuance in that. But when you strip that stuff away, which is what happens when poor bitrate sort of comes into the mix, it makes the game look, I would say, noticeably worse than it does in person. And I went back to that initial showing with the gameplay, and I think this combination of poor compression with just jumping around chaotically without players being able to understand what the core gameplay loop is just paints a very negative picture, and it just winds up looking like any of those normal games as a service, mobile gamey kind of things.
Okay.
And it's not really quite like that.
Right.
In fact, after playing it for a while, especially when you play as King Shark, it actually plays a lot like Crackdown.
Okay.
And once I started to treat it more like Crackdown, but with an actual, with these characters and surprisingly fun story, I've been able to have some fun despite that. And that's not something I expected to say based on everything I'd seen prior, because there was a lot of messiness going on. And part of that comes from just also things like the HUD, the initial HUD, the way they showed it. I shut a lot of that stuff down. You can turn some of that stuff off. The damage numbers and some of the readouts and indicators you get, I recommend switching things off because the default setup is just a mess. It's just text and numbers everywhere and it looks terrible, I think. But when you turn it off, you can kind of ignore it and it feels a bit better. I'm feeling scattered because I'm still in the middle of my video on this, but I don't think this is a very middle of the road experience for me. And it's only like pleasantly surprising because I did have such low expectations, but I'm kind of enjoying the storytelling so far. I don't know how it's going to end up, but I like the cutscenes. I like the characters in it. I think they're really well voiced and acted. And this comes after playing Gotham Knights for the first time this week, which has some of the worst delivery I've ever seen. Like, it was just dreadfully boring. Zero engagement. Here, though, when the characters are on the screen and dealing with other characters in this world, it's actually surprisingly compelling, I thought.
Okay.
It's kind of tense. So it has me wanting to continue. I think this game would have been better if they had left all the service stuff out of it. I actually do think that's made the product worse than it should have been. And in fact, even on day one, I had issues where, so we got the £100 early access version first on the Xbox, right? Mm-hmm. And you pay a lot of extra money for that early access for this game. And on the first day of testing in the afternoon, the servers just went down for a while. So I was stuck and I couldn't do any more capture. So I was like, all right, I'll just sit here, twiddle my thumbs and start writing or something, which I did. And it eventually came back up, but that's the kind of thing that it feels unacceptable to me when you're asking customers to pay that much extra money for something and then you're not getting that.
Yeah.
And just being connected to the servers all the time. There should have been an online mode from day one. You don't need to play online.
An offline mode. Yeah, I get what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly, right?
Yeah, and there was also stories that the game auto-completed when you first started it.
Yeah,
which is not great. And prior to that, of course, there was the preview period where the press were, let's just say, unkind, or rather, well, there's a kind of, how can you describe it? A precedent that a preview isn't too judgmental about a game until you've actually gone hands-on with final code. But IGN, and not just IGN, by the way, a lot of outlets basically just came out straight and said, not really enjoying this, to be honest, which is not often seen. And it was quite astonishing to see that unfold. But it does seem that there has been a bit more positive reaction to it. I decided to have a go on it last night. I was on PC, and we've got problems there, haven't we, John? I mean, in the wake of Arkham Knight, you'd think that this wouldn't happen again, but there are some profound issues with the PC version of Suicide Squad to the point where I can't even look at it at this point. And I'm not exaggerating with that. It's
okay.
Not great.
Let's be clear here. So I am also looking at the PC version. On the consoles, I think if you're playing on Xbox Series X or PS5, you're going to have a good time in terms of like the performance, the experience. It looks good. Xbox Series S, you'll see in the video. It's something. PC though, I would argue we have another Jedi Survivor / possibly Arkham Knight on our hands. Maybe not as bad as Arkham Knight at launch.
They won't withdraw it from sale.
No, I don't think it was like Arkham Knight had some serious issues, and I don't think that's this bad. The issues here on PC are more, they just really impact the general experience, even on a high-end PC. Absolutely. So first of all, this game has major frame time problems. You cannot get smooth motion. Even when your frame rate is high, everything about it just looks kind of choppy in motion and not right. in a way that's not the case on the consoles.
Yeah.
I know you felt that, Rich, right? Just looking around with the mouse playing, it feels bad.
It is bad. And even with a joypad, right, where you can basically...
It's not smooth.
I mean, yeah, the difference between mouse and joypad is with a joypad rather, you can actually change the camera angle in a kind of smooth, sweeping way, but you don't get smooth, sweeping motion. It looks awful. It's like similar to what we saw with EAWRC, where the camera update is not seemingly in sync with the movement, which just looks bizarre. It's
very
unsightly.
looking.
The cutscenes just look really, really bad.
Well, actually, some of the cutscenes, they do have some camera motion issues on consoles as well, but because it's capped at 60, it feels a bit more like sort of an unsteady camera look to it.
Right.
But on PC, if you're running with a VRR screen and an uncapped frame rate, trying to get those higher frames, it really messes up the cutscenes, and they look terrible.
Yeah.
As a result. But the arguably more serious problem is that it's an open world Unreal Engine 4 game. So what do you think's going to be in here? It's stutter. There's so much stutter in this game. It is nonstop stuttering. It's bad. And this is also one that compiles shaders every time you boot the game, by the way.
What's that all about? That's bizarre.
I don't know.
We've
seen that before.
Absolutely. Hogwarts does it. It's exclusive to Unreal Engine, and I don't quite understand why.
But I think there is some shader comp stutter in this game, but it's more traversal stutter that's the problem. Just moving through the world, the game is constantly just like hitching, stuttering. How far did you play, Rich? Did you actually make it to the city?
I did make it to the city, yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Oh, so you got to see it's bad in the
It's
city.
not great, yeah.
No, it feels terrible. And if you look at the frame time graphs, you can see it. It's just all over the place. And we're all running on pretty high-end machines, I would say, right?
Well, you're not going to get much better than a 4090 with a 13900K. And, I was doing stuff like, going to DLSS performance mode.
Yes.
Which you shouldn't really do. And, you can be running at 144 frames per second. It still doesn't look right. It's just bizarre.
And actually, the stutters get worse at those higher frame rates.
Yeah, absolutely. Longer, right? I mean, the higher you are, the lower you fall, really. That's the way it works with the stuttering.
On top of that, though, the PC version has ray traced reflections as an option, and it has to be some of the least optimized or at least heaviest ray traced reflections I've ever seen. And given what they look like, I'm not sure it justifies that performance hit. It's very CPU heavy. So I'm using a 12900K CPU, it's getting older now, but it should still be adequate for this, especially considering ray tracing performance in so many other games. The RT reflections, there are points where my frame rate would dip into the 30s, which is unacceptable.
Wow. Okay.
It's not smooth.
Yeah.
And so I can't play it with ray tracing on, and that is the one big visual feature that it has over the consoles.
Yeah. We got this question here from Eric Hurst. John, I have played a bit of Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, and I think that there is a great game deep underneath the shell of a live service game that presents itself as. In fact, it sort of reminds me of the feeling I got playing Arkham Knight on PC day one back in the day, an excellent game that was buried under a thick pile of mud that was the PC port. Yet it seems Arkham Knight has managed to climb out of the mud and become a fantastic game in most aspects on every platform. Do you think history will be as kind to Suicide Squad? Do you think that if Rocksteady puts in the work to undo some of the terrible games as a service tropes, as they've already claimed they will by doing things such as removing the always online story mode, that someday the game will rise to some form of glory? Or instead, now that it has started down the dark path, will it forever dominate its destiny? What do you make of that?
Well, the first thing is I want to point out the line. He says, do you think history will be as kind to Suicide Squad? Which is funny in the context of a game as a service, given that its history will likely amount to being offline and no longer playable. But we'll see. Hopefully it's not the case.
Well, they're saying here there's going to be an offline version of the story mode.
I guess the question is, how will this remain accessible long term? We'll see. Hopefully. But I don't know, man. I know some people were hard on Arkham Knight. I loved Arkham Knight from the beginning. I thought it was awesome. I preferred it to Arkham City,
The
honestly.
console versions were fine, right? You know, there was
It was
some
excellent,
some
yeah.
performance issues when in the Batmobile, but it was fundamentally
Barely,
sound.
I'd say. It was almost completely locked with perfect frame pacing and just stunning visuals for the time. It was arguably the best looking game that had been released at that time. I would say, or at least in the top 5.
It was up there.
It was up there. It was something special. When you go back to it now and you're like, wow, this is stunning. Suicide Squad, I think fundamentally, I do think the core gameplay loop is reasonably fun, but the actual mission design lacks the flair and interesting design elements that you get in the Batman games, because a lot of it does, unfortunately, even though the core combat can be enjoyable, it does still often amount to going to parts on a map and shooting guys. And again, that's not necessarily bad, but there have been, however, some hints. There's been some sequences that feel somewhat, I guess, more interesting narratively and sort of set piece like to a degree. Like the first, I don't want to spoil too much, but like there's that point early on where you first encounter Batman, and that alone was, I thought, pretty cool to set up evil Batman there, you know. But beyond that, after you survive that little sequence, you're actually let out into this sort of museum piece that you're kind of exploring with like all of Batman's like accomplishments.
Yep.
And you see all the villains and the heroes sort of spelled out within, and hearing your characters comment on what they hear from the little speaker boxes you can go up to press. And it's a fun little moment that adds a lot. And those are the types of things that have sort of made the game more interesting to want to continue playing, I would say. Because the core loop, while fun enough, could very well become very tiresome by the end, which the Arkham games specifically were known for very creative, carefully crafted level designs. Yeah, in City and Night, you did have the open world environment, but it was not that large, and it was designed as sort of like a web, almost a hub-like area that connected these much larger, carefully crafted levels together. And there's a lot less of that in this game, from what I can tell.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't get any kind of sort of immensely appealing wow factor from starting the game. You know,
No, not a wow. Certainly not a wow factor.
no. Yeah. Difficult one.
Oh man, so we'll see. I think this game is going to go down as okay. I think it's not the disaster people expected it to be.
That is kind of damning with faint praise, though.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a
it is.
bad game, and I've had some fun with it, and I didn't expect that necessarily, but it is. And I do think some aspects of the visuals will be very remembered as well. I think the cutscenes in particular, it's not gameplay, I get it, but in terms of just pure visual design, the actual cutscene quality is extremely good.
Yeah, character
the animation
design's
work,
first
the
class.
performances, it's striking. You actually want to see them continue to interact with one another in a way that was not the case in Gotham Knights, which woof, those cutscenes, man, that's not very good.
Yeah, just you know, for the benefit of those who aren't on the supporter program, John spent an hour with Gotham Knights this week and recorded it for posterity, and it's become the second entry in the John Versus series that's exclusive content just for supporters. Seems to be going down well.
Yeah, people have enjoyed it.
I did enjoy the fact that initially you were quite enthusiastic about it during the first investigation scene of the tutorial. And then you got out into the city, and on your ultra high-end PC, you were dipping beneath 60 frames per second. And there was this kind of air of incredulity about the whole thing. It's like, what's causing this? How is this happening?
You don't see it on the screen, right? You're looking at how the game looks, and you're like, why is it run like this?
Yeah, it didn't quite make sense.
It doesn't make sense.
And didn't. Yeah.
It still does not.
I don't think we've got too much more to say about Suicide Squad without spoiling the content. But yeah, I think people are going to be talking about this for quite some time. And I guess we'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on. So reports emerged this week from Bloomberg that a major analyst in Japan who specializes in examining the supply chain for displays, they're making the claim that Nintendo's next generation console is going to have an 8-inch display. There have been previous reports that there'll be an 8-inch 1080p display. So we seem to be seeing some sort of, sort of agreement between very different sources here that is what's going to happen. We can't confirm that. We don't know that in the here and now. But what we do know is that the concept of having an 8-inch display on a handheld machine could have profound implications on the expectation levels that we should set for the machine. So let me explain here, right? So here we have the Switch OLED, which is the machine that has the largest display in the current Switch lineup, right? That's a 7-inch display, 7-inch OLED display. And when we're talking about 8-inch, we've got the PlayStation Portal. There it is. And it's basically, we're looking at a vastly, larger display there, which means a vastly larger handheld. I mean, maybe not as hulking as this beast. And in turn, you've got to ask yourself questions like, well, is this actually going to be a Switch 2 if, your Joy-Cons aren't going to be able to attach to it? Because that would be a bit of a struggle. And, it just wouldn't look right. It would be a bit weird. Lots of questions that are being raised in the wake of this news. John, what do you think?
Yeah, so I think if they're going for that large size, my best guess would be that they have sort of accepted the fact that this is going to be a larger machine than the original Switch. And based on the rumored specs and what we've been hearing about it, I would expect that the chip powering it, the SoC, is not going to be an especially small package.
Yeah.
And thus, between that and the battery life considerations, I would imagine that they're going to find every way to increase the amount of internal real estate. And increasing the screen size is a great way to do that, because the consumer can enjoy the bigger size, but it automatically means your device has to be bigger, and now there's more interior space. And I think at this point we've reached a point where people are somewhat more accepting of larger handhelds again. We're in the post iPad tablet world, and things like Steam Deck and everything have taken off and have become very successful. Maybe not Nintendo level kind of mass market success, but I genuinely think people will be more accepting of a big machine. And I would not be surprised to see the Joy-Con removed entirely and replaced with onboard controls.
Right.
I think the Joy-Con concept was neat. It kind of worked, but in practice, I suspect that people weren't switching between them that often, and it ultimately just made the machine feel somewhat flimsier. It was another point of failure. When holding it, it always had a little bit of a wiggle to it, just a little bit, just enough where you're like, this doesn't feel great in the hands. And I never use the Joy-Con really. When I dock it, I just use a Pro controller, so I wouldn't mind that either.
But that is a peripheral, right? Which kind of suggests that if you can't remove your controller from Switch 2, they would have to include
They would have to include it in the box. I agree, which adds to the expense, of course. So that is an interesting shift, and I'll be curious to see what they do with that. But yeah, it's that. You remember those weird rumors though about the double screen thing?
Right.
I wonder what's going on here. There's so much we just don't know about this machine right now and what they're trying to do. And even the name Switch, we've been calling it the Switch 2, but when you remove the Joy-Con, I mean, technically you can still dock or undock, but it kind of takes part of the meaning of the Switch name away from it, right?
Yeah.
So, which also, I'm very curious to see what's going to become of this hardware. And I hope that they do reveal this somewhat soon. I feel like if they're going to launch it this year, we're going to have to hear about it in the next few months.
I mean, I think that the idea of a bigger Switch, it does feel like a natural evolution, because if you go from the original Switch that had a 6.2-inch LCD, then you go to the OLED, which has a 7-inch OLED display, the magnitude of increase in the size of the display is pretty similar to that, 0.8 inches versus 1 inch. It makes a lot of sense, especially if you're looking at some of these Windows devices that people tend to like, and they might have 7-inch screens, but they have very large controls attached, or like the, PlayStation Portal size device as well. So I think the Switch 2 yes, exactly, the 7.4 inch OLED Steam Deck, of course. I think that the Switch 2 probably would have pretty reasonable dimensions in that context, even if they go with a larger display, because the controls will probably be comparatively quite a bit smaller. I know people are upset about the LCD thing, and I kind of think that this to me feels like classic Nintendo and very natural, and I wasn't expecting an OLED device. I hope that
it is so
yeah, Nintendo, it's very Nintendo. And also, like, if you look at the production cost of an OLED screen, it's only like 25 or 30% more than a comparable LCD, so it's not even like that much of a cost savings.
Yeah, but if everything else about the machine is that expensive and they have to bundle in a controller, I can see why they would want to cut those costs.
And also, I hope that this would set them up for maybe a supercharged OLED model in maybe 2 years or something that maybe has HDR support or something else that's exciting.
See,
right.
But I was hoping for HDR support out of the
game,
because I feel like the Switch, this concept would be perfect for that, because if you're HDR on the go, everybody can experience the games in HDR.
Yeah.
Yes.
I also just think that people should understand historically, like I played a lot on earlier Nintendo handhelds like the DS, the 3DS, the Wii U, which was a handheld sort of technically, right? And those like TN LCDs, well, in the 3DS, it depended on what panel you got from the panel lottery, but like it could be a TN LCD. Those were like really horrible panels in retrospect. So I think even like a sort of semi-decent IPS panel on the Switch 2 before being upgraded to an OLED a couple of years later, it's not the worst thing in the world, especially for like really bright games that don't depend on having really deep dark contrast. There are those titles like Metroid Prime 2, or like a feature in Metroid Prime, or like a Luigi's Mansion, but most games like Mario Karts will probably still look pretty decent on an LCD.
I just hope it's a decent LCD, right? Because the LCD in the original Switch and the original Steam Deck, for that matter, they're garbage tier. They don't look good. Games actually, it feels like the hardware got more of an upgrade internally just because of the screen. Like it makes that big of a difference. So.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah, this is all really interesting. I mean, the concept of having an 8-inch screen does mean a larger device, and that kind of makes sense if what we're hearing about the Switch processor, the new SoC, the new Tegra, is true, that it's an 8-nanometer chip, which is going to be quite large, but also quite cheap for Nintendo to buy, which would make sense. That's exactly what happened with Tegra X1 on the original Switch. Old process, therefore cheap to buy, cheap to make, cheap to buy. And therefore, if you've got a larger chip that needs better cooling, then you have a larger device. How do you make that device work from an ergonomic perspective, from an aesthetic perspective? Well, you put a bigger screen on it. Kind of all sort of starts to come together. Maybe we're going to get this completely wrong. The concept of having detachable Joy-Cons, I mean, we're not ruling it out by any means. It's just they would be like Joy-Con 2s, Super Joy-Con or whatever. They'd be very different configuration because the casing has necessarily got to be quite different. I mean, if you look at the Switch here, the Joy-Con is basically flush with the depth of the machine there. If the new machine is deeper, how are these things going to attach? I don't think there could be any sort of level of compatibility there.
Maybe wireless compatibility?
Wireless, possibly, yeah, right? I guess that would make sense. I guess also the question is, the whole Switch concept becomes something quite different then, doesn't it? The concept of having to bundle in a separate controller because you
Rich, do you have your Steam Deck OLED there, by the way, handy?
No, I don't. I have the standard one.
Picking up the Steam Deck and then the Switch OLED, I had this impression that the Switch OLED was heavier somehow.
No, I don't think so.
Like it genuinely felt. It felt like, I think it's because it has that sort of metal body on it, and there's something about it that made it feel like chunkier somehow,
right?
Despite being smaller. So I haven't looked at the official measurements, so I was curious about that.
There's such an air of mystery around the next generation Switch at the moment. I'm surprised there haven't been more leaks, to be honest. Maybe Nintendo's sort of playing it safe with the design of the development kit. it might not be anything like final hardware. Might just be an anonymous looking black box for all we know.
What if they do a retro switch that uses a CRT with like big old cast iron rails on the side for putting your Joy-Cons on, just to hold the weight?
Man,
you put the battery in your pocket like the Vision Pro.
That's quite a flight of fancy, though. I guess, I hope to see something new soon, and something that puts an end to all of the speculation. I do remember, prior to the launch of prior to the reveal of the original Switch 1, it was, all bets were off. There was crazy talk. There was people saying it's going to be a high-end AMD device. We had pretty good sourcing that it was going to be using Tegra X1, or maybe some variant thereof, which turned out to be broadly accurate. But man, things are sort of really ratcheting up to the max at the moment. I just want some answers at this point. I think we can safely assume it's going to be an NVIDIA Tegra in there, but that's pretty much it. Form factor, and I think the thing that, going back to the original reveal trailer, it was all about the everyday use of the device. What set this apart from a standard home console. They showed all of the potential use case scenarios. I would love to see a rerun of that, just to show us what this device is actually envisaged as, and, whether there is going to be any kind of continuity with the original Switch 1. I think there'll be backwards compatibility. I think that's pretty much a given at this point. But, how does this device actually work? I think there's fantastic potential, but I'll just have to wait and see. In the meantime, it does look as though we're getting an 8-inch LCD display. Sorry, John.
I'm resigned to that fact.
Okay, let's move on. Final news topic of the week, and it's music to John's ears, because for a while now there's been some concern about Gran Turismo Sport and the fact that you can't actually play it unless you're online. And it has been revealed, Polyphony Digital has allegedly confirmed that there will be a final patch that basically allows for the game to be run offline. And you didn't really see this coming, right, John? You were fearing the worst.
Yeah, because traditionally most publishers do not care about this sort of thing, and they're very happy to just let a game expire and become unplayable. It just happened with The Crew. It will happen. It's either way, that game is going away. It won't be playable anymore. And it was, so GT Sport has offline capability, but you couldn't actually save your game or really do anything in there. There was no real progression that was possible, making it basically unplayable without the servers. But here they've decided to update the game to ensure that at least all the single player stuff in the game will be playable as it was without a server connection, allowing you to save offline. Now, obviously, this also means that disc versions of the game will continue to rely on needing an update to be functional, but it's more likely the update servers, at least with Sony stuff especially, where their update servers can be directly accessed from a web browser, and you can actually download those updates and put them on like a hard drive or something, and presumably in the future deploy them yourself if you wanted to. So there is something there at least. So I'm happy to see that. It also gives me a lot more confidence in Gran Turismo 7 long term, that they would eventually allow you to play all the single player stuff without a connection with the final patch, which I'm pleasantly surprised. I genuinely did not expect that. I did not think they would do it. So few companies would. That's time, money, engineering efforts spent on something for a product that's being discontinued, right? You have to justify that budget. Like, yeah, this is like, if you're discontinuing a product because it's reached a certain point in its life, to be able to say, okay, we're going to invest X amount of money into producing additional work and additional patches for this product to ensure that people can keep playing it. That sounds great to the normal consumer, but I don't feel like, when Ubisoft says we're closing on The Crew, do you really think that they care that much about that? Like, nope, we're done with it. Wash the hands. That's the feeling I get. Higher ups would be unwilling to spend that money. They're cutting it for a reason. So why would they spend more money to go back and do that? Is the feeling I get. I don't know internally what those look like. Maybe there are people fighting for this stuff and this one just happened to get through. But we've not really seen it before. Not like this. So we wanted to highlight it because it is an example of actual good behavior on that front. And hopefully more publishers with games that could potentially be lost see what's happened here, see the response, and consider doing it in the future.
Mm-hmm. Any reaction to that, Oliver?
No, not particularly. I just hope this sets a standard, and I hope that certain online-only games like Suicide Squad are patched with this functionality in mind, because it is really, really annoying when you're playing a game that is, ostensibly an online-only game, but could probably be played perfectly well in a single-player offline mode, and you can't do it because the servers are down for some reason or another.
Yeah, I'm reminded of that whole thing that happened with the Matrix Awakens. Do you remember that, Oliver?
Oh yeah, that was a slight panic over that.
Yeah, essentially, I mean, it is an entirely offline experience. There's no need whatsoever for an online check, and basically there was a fault with the servers, right? So you couldn't actually load this really important part of Unreal Engine 5 history anymore. It just didn't work on any system for no good reason. It would have required hackers to go in and, on the PlayStation version at least, where it is hackable, to actually remove that server check. And I remember getting in touch with Epic about this and not getting sort of recognition of what actually was happening. And I had to kind of press it and say, look, it's just you can't run this really important demo anymore. I'm still baffled as to why it hasn't been updated to remove that server check, but there it is. So yeah, that's just a sort of minor example, really. And I'm glad to see that things are changing with Gran Turismo Sport there, because, obviously it's been superseded by a new game in the series. But, regardless of that, the original should be able to be played, years from now, decades from now even. And that's just not possible if the server just goes offline suddenly. And I think that's something that people don't often sort of appreciate, John, is, they don't really understand the timescales that we're talking about here when we talk about preservation. It's not just, what's happening in the next, 2 or 3 years. It's like what's happening in the next 2 or 3 decades. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
Like, you know what? I'm not a fan of a game like Battleborn, for instance, but I think it should be able to be played today.
Yeah.
And it's dead. You can't play it.
Mm-hmm.
There was that one game from Platinum Games, I guess it was the Square Enix published one, Babylon's Fall,
right,
which I think also is dead. Again, it seems like, who cares, not a big loss, but that's a piece of history, gaming history from a very big developer that's just gone.
Mm-hmm.
Also, their Apple Arcade game just vanished as well, which Apple Arcade is a whole nother problem, because everything on there that doesn't come out anywhere else, when it goes away from that service, it's gone forever, and there's really no way for any normal user to get access to it, as far as I can tell. Okay. So that sucks.
Okay, but good news in this case.
Good news in this case.
Okay, excellent. Well, that's the end of the news for this week. So let's plow on into supporter Q&A, which is the part of the show where, every week on our Patreon page, we ask our supporters to come up with questions. They could be related to the news topics of the week or anything, really. And we're going to begin with this question from Never Ready Eddie. Hi DF great work as always. I note in John's video on Tekken 8, he votes Epic's TSR as being the best of the many upscalers in the game. I think there's like 17 in total. This isn't the first time DF has picked TSR over DLSS, the long-standing champ. I wonder how it can beat NVIDIA's DLSS given their behemoth amount of technical wizards, and more specifically their use of AI and hardware to do the tricks. Surely Epic can't have the same resources behind its TSR development that NVIDIA has put into DLSS. How does Epic's TSR work compared to DLSS and its AI wizardry? This is an interesting question, right, John? Because I think typically DLSS is better than TSR.
Yes.
And they work fundamentally from the same inputs.
I think the point of distinction that he's missing here, and this is kind of a UI issue with the way Tekken presents it, is that the difference is that this game supports DLSS, not DLAA. So DLSS is working from a lower input resolution. When using TSR within Tekken 8, there is a resolution slider exposed, and this allows you to set the internal resolution to 100%. So you're basically eliminating the upsampling portion of it. And it's basically using TSR just as TAA, which is what DLAA would do if it was offered, which is to say 100% scaling TSR versus DLAA. I'd be curious to see them. perhaps they would be comparable. Maybe DLAA would have an edge, but in this case, I think to compare it, we have to figure out the res of DLSS quality and then set the res slider appropriately for TSR and see how they compare.
Right. Yeah, it'll be 67% for
right, which I don't even. Well, you can set this maybe 65%. Yeah, 65%. So you can get close. I have to look at that. But then the other part of TSR was all the Steam Deck talk where I was recommending TSR, and there that's DLSS is obviously irrelevant since it does not work on the Steam Deck. And that's really where TSR showed its muscle, because that was using upscaling and often from lower resolutions even than FSR, and it absolutely wiped the floor with FSR, TAAU, and even XESS.
That's interesting.
So that impressed me. It was much cleaner. I mean, you saw in the footage, right? The FSR footage in particular was nasty comparatively.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much a nightmare scenario for these upscalers, because, you know, basically the fighters are moving and therefore, you know, new visual information that isn't in prior history is being taken into, you know, appearing in view. And it kind of has to work along, you know, with very little information to reconstruct at that point.
It was like 60 to 65% of 720p, which is not much.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been impressed with TSR in Fortnite and what it can do at 720p from basically like 360p, you know, performance mode, which is quite impressive. But then again, Fortnite, I think, is a kind of game where it's not heavy on, you know, visual detail, so it's quite friendly to these upscalers. Any thoughts on this, Oliver?
No, I would just contest the idea that NVIDIA is necessarily putting a lot more software engineers on this problem. I think Epic probably has a healthy amount of software engineers trying to improve TSR to the best of their ability. And yeah, I typically think that DLSS typically has less annoying breakup than TSR, but I would definitely rank TSR in almost every case I've looked at it, including in RoboCop recently, above FSR2 in terms of avoiding like annoying disocclusion artifacts and things like that. It definitely does present a more stable image when in motion, for sure.
Yeah, it's great to actually have those options available, especially on a handheld. And there are scenarios where I prefer to use XESS over FSR2 on a handheld. You pay more seemingly from a computational perspective, but you just lose far less detail. So it's great to have those options. It puzzles me a bit like Immortals of Avium just removed the option completely on PC. You know, it's free. It's part of Unreal Engine. Include it. It just doesn't really make sense to me. Let's move on to the next question. And this one is from Kyrith. Hello from Cincinnati, DF crew, exclamation point. Yes, your neck of the woods from back in the day, right, John?
Hometown, baby.
My question,
nasty natty.
My question is for everyone, but especially John. What is it that makes per pixel motion blur look so good, but sample and hold persistence blur looks so bad? When I strain my eyes staring for the difference, they end up looking rather similar. Perhaps it's just that games which ought not to have motion blur, 2D scrollers, suffer from persistence blur. I think there's more to it. Thoughts? Interesting one, right? But we kind of like more fans of per object motion blur, right? As opposed to...
which is per pixel motion blur, of course. But the main difference comes down to the way velocity and momentum is translated into a visual flourish. Right. I think if you actually go back to something like Tekken 6 or Tag 2, I was looking at those recently. The motion blur in action looks awesome in those games. The way the fighters move, it's very exaggerated. If you pause a frame, though, you'll see that the amount of blurring actually happening is significant. It's such that if the LCD persistence blur looked anything like that, it would basically be impossible to see. And it's because it's a very short time frame where this really fast motion uses this super high type of motion blur with this shutter speed designed to make it look that way. So it exaggerates the motion. So normally during slow movements, you won't actually see that much motion blur when it's done well, but when any sort of like big animation or huge change happens, the motion blur sort of fills in the gaps between the frames and creates this like fluid look to it that actually resembles what you get with like a film or with a camera.
That's the whole point, right?
Right. It's a simulated camera. Right, yes. That's what it does.
Which isn't the persistence from sample and hold.
No, sample and hold style blur is across the board. It doesn't really get it doesn't really become more exaggerated. Like obviously the faster you move, the blurrier it gets, but not in the same way, right? And it just kind of obscures details in motion in a way and it's across the entire image all the time rather than specific objects. Like if the background's rotating a little bit in versus the fast motion, like a fighter punching also, as you mentioned, Rich, you can apply per pixel motion blur. Sometimes you've seen games that sort of apply it more to specific objects, like the original Crysis actually was like that. So there's many different ways to do it, but I think that's fundamentally what it is when you take into account the momentum and velocity and the way that looks and what it allows you to do. But I'm actually curious to hear Oliver's take as well.
Yeah, I think one big problem with like LCDs and sample and hold blur relative to like per pixel motion blur techniques is that you get persistence of that blur across multiple frames, whereas with per pixel blur it really should just be between those two frames, so you end up with kind of like long trails of ghosted motion. And you're seeing that because of the display characteristics. It's not like a computed thing between two frames that should look very consistent and even like a film camera would produce it. So I think that's like, to me, that's a big problem where it just ends up looking really smeary because it's actually smearing the movement from multiple frames. And you're seeing that persistence for longer, much longer than you would in a game with per pixel motion blur.
Yeah. That all makes sense. I mean, this is an artifact of the display technology, not an attempt to emulate the behaviors of a camera. It's two very different things there.
Exactly.
Let's move on to the next question. This one from Vasil Miladinov. Hope I got the pronunciation of that one right. Hi DF, exclamation point. With frame generation technology becoming more common, do you foresee an eventual end to VRR displays? Virtual reality headsets already avoid them due to motion sickness, and it seems like a lot of complexity to keep around when you could just fill in extra frames at the source. Interesting question there. I mean, when we were, I think I've mentioned this before, when we were at AMD for Gamescom, they did seem to indicate that the end game for frame generation technology is just that it would match the sample rate, the refresh rate of your monitor, and just automatically give very smooth motion. I think from my perspective, just the presence of frame generation, it's not always going to be a feature that you will want to use, right? You should have
always available.
Yeah, the point is that PC is supposed to give you options, additional options, not take options away. And I don't think VRR is going anywhere anytime soon. And of course, there are additional things, of course, like let's say you've got a 300 hertz display, but, frame generation kind of looks best at 150 or 160, or a clean multiple of 60 to match like, full motion video, that sort of thing. There's a lot of use case scenarios where using the two together actually makes a lot of sense. But what do you make of this, John, particularly this thing about VR headsets avoiding?
So I think he's missed the reason for why they might specify motion sickness. It's actually, I think, not due to motion sickness. It's because to solve this problem, they have to do ultra low persistence display techniques, which is basically like pulsing, strobing, black frame insertion kind of thing, right? Which until this new G-Sync Pulsar, I think it was called, that NVIDIA revealed, there wasn't really an effective way to combine VRR with that low persistence sort of update.
Yeah.
And in VR, that would be great to combine those because there are plenty of games like on the Quest, for instance, even on PSVR and any other platform really, where the frame rate is not consistently hitting that target refresh rate. And being able to handle that with VRR would be excellent if you could combine it with the low persistence stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you're making a VR headset, it's better to go for low persistence, no blur versus VRR. But if you could have both, that would be optimal.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Oliver, anything to add?
I think in a final sense, it probably would be quite nice to just have a fixed panel refresh rate and a fixed display frame rate on the console or the PC. I think in part VRR is an artifact of the fact that we have finite hardware power, which is maybe a problem that won't ever go away, but it is a solution for that in much the same way that dynamic resolution is often a solution for that problem in console games. But to me, frame generation just feels like a different trade-off in terms of quality. For displays with variable backlight, with dimming zones, with BFI, for sure getting away from variable refresh helps out those technologies.
Let's move on to the next question. This one from Kokimo. I believe that's the the pronunciation. I don't know. Hey fellas, what speed of hardware adoption should we reasonably expect from the gaming community, PC or console? Legacy support is great as it allows people with moderately older to significantly older hardware to still participate in the latest games. However, it also tends to hold back new games from reaching the heights they otherwise could have had if they'd simply abandoned older hardware considerations and focused on what's next. Consoles are the prime example, of course, since they have distinct hardware generations that only update every 3 to 7 years. But even PC hardware can start to show its age rather quickly as games try to push the boundaries, e.g. Alan Wake. It's an interesting discussion, right? Because it does fundamentally come down to the concept of there needs to be a reset point in order to actually start to use new features. And it's kind of been blurred with this particular generation. If you compare the transition from PS3 to PS4 to the transition from PS4 to PS5, that was very different, So when, what is the reasonable speed of hardware adoption? Oliver, any thoughts on this one?
I think consoles sort of set the pace by dint of their relative market size and the kinds of games that tend to be developed around consoles. So I would say every 7 years, roughly speaking, would be a reasonable pace to at least be able to keep pace with running the latest software. Although it kind of depends on what the console spec is relative to PC specs at that time. Like if you had a 2 gigabyte GPU in 2013, that would probably not fare too well in titles released in 2018, right? Even though it would have been a similar generation of hardware relative to consoles. Mm-hmm. So I would say kind of roughly maybe that 5 to 7 year range would be reasonable just to run the games. But obviously if you're aiming to run the games at high settings with new PC graphical features, with path tracing, whatever, that isn't really going to cut it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. You look at the Steam hardware survey, and that pretty much gives you an idea of the transition rate. We are now at the point where, it's 2020 GPUs that are coming to the fore now. 3060 is doing really well. It seems to be at the top most months. And that's like a 3-year-old GPU. But at the same time, there's still people that really, really don't want to let go of their 10 series Pascal cards. But I really think they should. John, what
1650s.
The 1650, man. Just go away. John, what do you think about this? I mean, the transition point was kind of blurred with this generation, but at the same time, cross-gen, I don't know. I do think a lot of people moved across to PlayStation 5 from PlayStation 4.
Yeah, no, that is kind of a tricky one.
I think it is.
I think with PCs, just like PC itself is intentionally like an open platform, so I think being able to push whatever you want should always be a thing. And I don't think there really can ever be a fixed sort of point where it says, "Oh, you can no longer use this hardware," right?
Right.
Because it's gonna vary per game. And that's the whole thing with minimum requirements on games, is that developers set what you need, and because it's an open platform, I don't think there's anybody's ever going to agree to like this is a fixed target spec that you need to hit. I think Microsoft tried it at one point. You remember with the Windows Vista like computer score thing,
right?
Yeah, remember you get the number assigned to your system, like, and they would put it on the box like, oh, if you hit this number, you can play the game, kind of thing. But I think it's gonna have to be the way it's always been. It used to be a lot worse, actually, where PC hardware was you could maybe stay current for a year, and then the following year everything's changed.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. Just the classic case in point, the rendition Verite, which I had.
Oh, absolutely. Like GPUs are expensive today, no doubt, but they can last a whole heck of a lot longer than they used to.
Yeah. They just generally tend to, you run them at lower frame rates and lower resolutions. But, there is the case of the DirectX 12 feature set. You kind of want that stuff now. You kind of want ray tracing. You want mesh shaders, certainly in the case of Alan Wake too.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But it is a sort of more gradual transition than we probably suspected there. But yeah, interesting nonetheless. But I think ultimately it does seem to be the dominant console that sets the agenda in terms of AAA game development. But then you've got there's a lot more to PC than AAA. You know, there's the esports side of things, there's the indie side of things. It's the performance targets do vary on a game by game basis, as do the feature set requirements. I'm sure there's a ton of games that just still run great on that 1650.
Absolutely.
But probably not more recent ones. I'm thinking more esports.
Esports.
Okay, let's move on to the final question. This one from Guy Mendez. Greetings, DF crew! Exclamation point. Got one here, especially for Rich. When did you shift your interests from the usual magazine-style game/hardware review focused more on consoles and console games to be more keen on the intricacies advances of PC technology like CPUs and GPUs, and the capabilities of hardware in general? Did it coincide with the foundation of Digital Foundry and your quest for reference-grade capture methods for displaying and measuring performance in games? Now, since I get the impression that Alex and John pretty much into the PC platform since its golden years, I want to know if there's a console or game exclusive for a console that made them reconsider that the PC was the be-all and end-all. Well, I'll take my question first. It's like two questions in one here. When did I get sort of interested in CPUs and GPUs? I think it's probably when Crysis came along, because that was such a, this is tricky. Doom. Doom was the game. If we go back to, was it 94, John, when Doom came out?
93.
93, yeah. We were sort of still in the midst of Super NES and Mega Drive at that point, and then suddenly Doom comes along, and it's a game and a game type that's was just revolutionary. It was just astonishing. And I wasn't even aware of the multiplayer angle at that point. It was only until like a year or so later when I visited a game developer, Virgin Interactive, in Irvine, California, that I saw people playing multiplayer Doom. And this again was like a completely different sort of experience to anything I'd ever experienced before. So that was the point where I think PC actually became sort of firmly a part of my sort of transition to wanting to know more about CPUs and GPUs. And certainly in terms of CPU performance, when we were doing this capture side of things, because there was no proper HD capture solutions back in the day, when you're streaming in like 720p or 1080p across a capture card and onto a hard drive, the file sizes were prohibitively large, so you needed a good CPU at that point. And, the single thread stuff on, the Pentium 4s and whatnot wasn't cutting it. And then AMD came along with the Athlon X2s, dual cores, Intel followed suit. That was, basically my aspirations for being able to do my job were tied intricately to the capabilities of CPU to stream that stuff. GPUs, yeah, I guess, just over the course of time, it became evident that consoles were a fixed platform with a finite level of processing power. What more can you do with any particular game? And inevitably, you end up on PC. And I think we're going to reach that point sooner rather than later in this current generation as well, until the PS5 Professional comes along. But I'm interested, John, in terms of the question here, because Guy is kind of suggesting that you were kind of Team PC all along, but that's not strictly true, is it?
I became Team PC in 1994.
Right.
But so there was this period where I didn't completely lose interest in consoles, but from about 94 to 98, most of my gaming time was focused on the PC. And it was games like Doom that pushed me in that direction. Doom, and then like Quake, Duke Nukem 3D, stuff like that. I was enamored with the 3D technology made possible in the PC. When 3D accelerator cards hit, I was super into that.
Yeah.
And I continue to play a lot of PCs since then, but there was a point, I guess, when the Sega Saturn started to get cheap in 97, my Mega Drive, Genesis nostalgia kind of kicked in, and I was like, oh man, I could totally get a Saturn for like nothing. And I started buying up a lot of Saturn games, and I found more love in that again, because it was a very different style of games. I also got a PlayStation around that era and started getting back into Japanese games. And I had friends with N64s that I also played, but I wasn't really big on the N64 at that era, to be honest. I kind of felt like the PC occupied any space that the N64 might have, weirdly enough, because the Ultra HLE also hit, you know.
Yes.
So I was able to then again experience Mario 64 and Zelda on my Voodoo equipped PC, and I was like, well, I don't need which it sounds silly, but that's how it was at the time. But I did have a Saturn and PlayStation. The PlayStation I had did have to be turned upside down. And yeah, the visuals and stuff you could get on Saturn and PlayStation, it wasn't PC quality at the time. I mean, 1998, it's like Unreal came out. Seeing Unreal running on a 3DFX card back then.
But what about Ridge Racer in '94?
Oh god, I freaking love Ridge Racer.
Yeah, but
no, absolutely.
Was that a sort of?
So that was the one. That was the point where I felt the urge to. Well, first of all, trying to drew me back into the arcades. I played a lot of arcade stuff, and I didn't get a PS1 right away. It was just a money thing more than anything. But I played it at friends' houses. And I did enjoy the heck out of that, but it actually pushed this thing in me of like, I want to spec my PC to do this as well.
Right.
And at the time I didn't recognize enough the sheer brilliance of Ridge Racer. I loved it, but you know, just trying to match those types of 3D graphics on a PC. And I felt like I could get further on the PC as PCs were expanding. And I made it my mission to try, like, I wanted to experience something like Daytona USA on a PC.
Mm-hmm.
And I kept feeling like, oh, surely we can do this. We're getting closer. I got Screamer over here. This is sweet. But obviously, as we know, we didn't really match Daytona for many years.
Mm-hmm.
The PC was not the place to do that just yet. The 60 frames per second was still kind of off the table for that kind of game, I would say. So I kept interest in the consoles during 94 to 98, and I did play PlayStation arcade stuff as well. But it wasn't until 97, so it's 97 is when I actually got both of the Saturn and PlayStation on my own, I believe it was. So I also made the mistake of selling my game. I kept other stuff, but I sold all my Game Boy stuff to fund another graphics card, and I always regretted it because it was all perfectly mint boxed games that I kept all just perfect. It was awesome. I sold them all to freaking, I don't remember. I sold them somewhere, and I took that money and got another graphics card.
So, Oliver, did you ever have a PC moment, or just?
Well, it's sort of funny because when I was a kid, like really young, I played almost exclusively on PCs. Like from, I'd say maybe 2003 to 2005 or 2006. When I was quite young.
Okay.
I actually had a PC with an AMD Athlon 3800 Plus and NVIDIA 6800 GT. So quite a good PC for that time period in like
that's really
2005. But then when the 7th gen of consoles rolled around, so it would have been 10 years old, 11 years old, I got a 360 from that point and then pretty much played exclusively on consoles, never really looked back. But I always had a PC that was at least mid-range, and I did play a lot of games on PC from time to time, but only usually when they were giving me like a hugely improved experience over the consoles, like the Crysis games. And that's pretty much what I do today. you know, like if a game is giving me additional features, or if I can't hit decent frame rates on console, if like the title is 30 FPS only, I will go over to PC, but otherwise I'll pretty much stay on consoles. And I became very interested in PC technology probably around 2010 or 2011 when I was starting to build PCs for myself. So it's basically my history. But yeah, nowadays I'm still primarily a console gamer, and that's reflected maybe in my coverage, but also my recreational choices.
Fair enough. I mean, I've been thinking about this thing about whether a console exclusive made them reconsider that PC was the be-all and end-all. And actually, if we go back to the sort of late 80s, 1990, yeah, I've talked about this in the past, but basically up until that point, I was using microcomputers, you know, up to the Commodore Amiga. And yeah, when I had my interview at Computer and Video Games to, you know, join that team, man, I saw the Sega Mega Drive, and it was doing things that the Amiga just couldn't do. You know, Afterburner 2 is just like phenomenal. I just couldn't believe my eyes about that. So that was something which basically spelled the end of any interest that I had in, like, you know, Amiga, Atari ST, that kind of generation. Yeah, that was certainly an eye opener. So yeah, that was another thing. It's not specifically PC, although I did have a PC at that point, but it was just a word processor. You know, I didn't even consider it for games. I don't think it could have done games at that point. It's like for desktop publishing and whatnot. So yeah, but yeah,
I'll tell you, Rich, though, even back in the 90s, I was already in like DF mode as a kid because like I would play or have games on like a Genesis. And then it's like, oh, there's a PC version of this, like Earthworm Jim or Pitfall. And I would want to get those versions, Sonic as well, just because it's like, I want to see what this is like on a PC. Right. Or how is this compares? I was comparing Super NES and Genesis back then. I remember like the first time I was like, whoa, they got a lens flare effect in Earthworm Jim on the Super NES, but like you're missing some of the pixels. And I very distinctively remembered looking at all of that stuff when I was back then and being super fascinated with how these different versions of the game stacked up.
Yeah, fascinating.
So it kind of sent me down this path.
Yeah, I mean, I remember the day where I was working in the computer and video games office, and one of the console importers rushed in with basically what was likely to be the first Super Famicom that entered the country. And we were just kind of like spellbound by Super Mario World and F-Zero, to the point where we thought it was over for Sega. You know, those games just looked completely unlike anything that we'd seen on the Mega Drive at that point. It just seemed like the next step forward. But obviously history turned out to be something quite different there. You actually got a really good library on both machines, and they kind of had a fantastic battle across the years there.
Yep.
But yeah, pretty amazing stuff. Really nice question, that one from Guy Mendez there. But that is the final question, and therefore the end of the show. So if you enjoyed
the longest episode ever.
I think that might just be because of the pauses we had to take that the end user won't be seeing. But yeah, anyway, yeah, that is the end of the show. So if you did enjoy it, please do like, subscribe, share, ring the bell for random things that may or may not appear on your phone. And DF supporter program, join our amazing community, get early access to the direct, get early access to a whole bunch of content, the ability to submit questions for the direct, submit topics, a whole bunch of amazing stuff happening there. But that's all from us for this week. Thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.